The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and burnt orange, casting long, dancing shadows across the sacred grove. In this hidden sanctuary, where the ancient baobab trees stood as silent witnesses, Amara leaned her head against the broad chest of Kofi. The air was thick with the scent of crushed jasmine and the distant, rhythmic thrumming of village drums, a sound that usually brought peace but today felt like a ticking clock. Amara, the daughter of the wealthiest ivory merchant in the land, was draped in silks that shimmered like moonlight, yet she felt more at home in the simple cotton tunic Kofi wore. Her father, Chief Okonkwo, measured a person's worth by the weight of their gold, but Amara measured it by the warmth in Kofi's eyes and the callous strength of his hands. They knew their love was a transgression against the rigid hierarchy of their world, a flame burning in a drought-stricken forest. Kofi took her hand, his thumb tracing the intricate henna patterns on her skin, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated through her. He spoke of a life beyond the stone walls of her father's estate, a life where they would wake to the song of the weaver birds and sleep under a canopy of stars without fear. He was a mere potter, molding red clay into vessels for the poor, yet in Amara's eyes, he was the architect of her soul's only true home. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the undergrowth, and the evening birds fell abruptly silent, their chirping replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Amara stiffened, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as she sensed the shift in the wind, a scent of expensive sandalwood and cold iron. It was the scent of her father's guards, a smell that signaled the end of their fleeting sanctuary and the beginning of a nightmare they could not outrun. They clung to each other for one final, desperate heartbeat, their breaths mingling in the cooling air as if trying to exchange souls. "No matter what happens," Kofi whispered, his eyes burning with a fierce, doomed loyalty, "my spirit will find yours in the land of the ancestors." Amara could not find the words to respond, for the shadows were closing in, and the golden cage of her birthright was finally about to shut its heavy, gilded doors. The great hall of Chief Okonkwo's palace was a monument to excess, filled with ivory tusks, bronze statues, and floors polished to a mirror-like sheen. Amara stood in the center of the vast space, her silk robes torn and her spirit bruised, facing her father and her mother, Zola, who sat upon thrones carved from dark ebony. The flickering oil lamps cast grotesque, elongated shadows against the walls, making the room feel like a cavernous mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Chief Okonkwo's face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone, his eyes devoid of the fatherly warmth that had once greeted Amara's childhood. To him, Amara was not a daughter, but a prize to be bartered, a political chip to be played in a game of empires and alliances. The fact that she had soiled her lineage by loving a common laborer was not just a disappointment. To him, it was a declaration of war against the family's prestige. "You have traded your crown for a handful of mud, Amara," Zola spoke, her voice like the hiss of a viper hidden in dry grass. There was no pity in her eyes, only a sharp, calculating anger that cut deeper than any blade could ever reach. Zola had spent her life climbing the social ladder, and she would not let her daughter's sentimental delusions tear down the fortress of wealth they had spent decades building. Amara looked at her parents, seeing them clearly for the first time, not as protectors, but as jailers who valued gold more than blood. "Kofi sees the woman I am, not the riches I carry," she cried out, her voice echoing through the hollow hall, trembling with a mix of defiance and heartbreak. She begged them to understand that love was the only currency that didn't lose its value in the grave, but her words fell on deaf ears and hardened hearts. The chief stood up, his heavy robes rustling like the wings of a scavenger bird, and signaled for the guards to step forward from the shadows. "If you choose the potter, then you choose the earth he works," he declared, his voice booming with a terrifying, final authority that chilled the marrow in Amara's bones. He didn't order her to her room. He ordered her to the cleansing, a word that in their culture meant a darkness from which few ever returned. The moon was a sliver of silver bone in the sky as the guards led Amara toward the Black River, the boundary between the living and the dead. Her parents followed at a distance, draped in heavy cloaks to hide their identities, their silence more deafening than the rushing water ahead. Amara's hands were bound with silk cords, The very material she used to love, now turned into the instrument of her captivity and impending doom. As they reached the jagged cliffs overlooking the churning rapids, the guard stepped back, leaving Amara alone with the two people who had brought her into the world. The air here was cold and mist-laden, the spray from the waterfall tasting of salt and ancient sorrows, as if the river itself were weeping for what was to come. Amara looked at her father, hoping for a flicker of regret, a single tear that might signal a change of heart, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "We do this for the family, Amara," Zola whispered, stepping forward to adjust Amara's hair one last time, a gesture that was hauntingly maternal, yet utterly devoid of love. She tucked a stray lock behind Amara's ear with a hand that didn't tremble, her eyes reflecting the cold moonlight like two flat, gray stones. It was the ultimate betrayal, a mother's touch used to steady a victim before the slaughter, a final lie told in the name of honor. With a sudden, violent shove, the guards, acting on a silent nod from the chief, pushed Amara toward the precipice where the earth crumbled into nothingness. She didn't scream. The shock of the betrayal stole the air from her lungs, leaving her only with the image of her parents turning their backs before she even hit the water. She fell through the dark air, a streak of white silk and broken dreams, her heart shattering long before her body struck the freezing, unforgiving surface of the river. The water swallowed her whole, pulling her down into the crushing depths where the currents fought over her like hungry spirits. As the last of the air bubbled from her lips, her final thought wasn't of the pain or the cold, but of the injustice that had snuffed out her light. In that moment of absolute darkness, a new force stirred within her, a cold, shimmering rage that refused to drown, a vow of vengeance that would bridge the gap between worlds. The next morning, the village of Oakhaven woke to the news that the beautiful Amara had succumbed to a sudden fever and passed away in the night. The chief and his wife put on a grand display of mourning, wearing ash-colored robes and hiring professional wailers to fill the air with artificial grief. They spared no expense for the funeral, burying an empty casket filled with stones and expensive spices to hide the absence of a body they had let the river claim. Kofi stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of hollowed-out agony, his world having collapsed into a pile of gray ash and silent questions. He did not believe the story of the fever. He had seen the way the guards looked at him, and he had felt the coldness radiating from the palace walls. He clutched a small clay bird he had made for her, his knuckles white, his heart screaming a name that no one else dared to whisper in the presence of the chief. Chief Okonkwo stood over the ceremonial grave, speaking of his daughter's purity and devotion to family, his voice steady and convincing to those who didn't know the truth. He looked at the mourning villagers, his eyes challenging anyone to doubt his word, his power acting as a shroud over the crime he had committed. Beside him, Zola wiped away a dry eye, her performance flawless, her mind already calculating how to restore the family's reputation now that the problem was gone. As the first shovelful of dirt hit the wooden lid of the casket, a sudden, unnatural wind swept through the cemetery, extinguishing the ritual candles and making the trees groan. The villagers shivered, sensing an ill omen, but the chief merely tightened his grip on his staff, refusing to acknowledge the shifting atmosphere. They thought they were burying their secret, piling earth and lies upon a tragedy, unaware that some debts are too heavy for the ground to hold. Deep beneath the surface of the Black River, miles away, Amara's body remained caught in the roots of an ancient, submerged tree, her eyes wide and glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. The water didn't rot her. It preserved her, the current stroking her hair like 1,000 spectral fingers as her soul began to knit itself back together with threads of pure spite. The fever the chief lied about was nothing compared to the heat of the fire that was now igniting in the heart of his drowned daughter. The palace was silent that night, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the moonlight, yet the air inside felt unnaturally damp and smelled of river silt. Zola lay in her bed, her sleep fitful and plagued by dreams of rushing water and the sound of silk tearing in the wind. She woke with a start, her skin clammy, feeling as though someone was standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with a gaze that could freeze the blood. She reached for a candle, her fingers trembling as she struck the flint, the small flame casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure draped in tattered, waterlogged silks, the hem of the garment dripping onto the polished floor with a rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Zola's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she realized the figure had no reflection in the wall mirrors. The figure stepped forward, and the light of the candle revealed a face that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. It was Amara, but her skin was the color of moonlight on water. Her eyes were no longer brown and warm, but twin pools of glowing indigo, reflecting the depths of the river that had claimed her. She didn't speak, but the sound of 1,000 drowning whispers filled the room, a chorus of accusations that vibrated in Zola's very skull. Amara. Zola gasped, her voice a fragile reed in the storm, her hands clutching the silk sheets that now felt like cold, wet weeds. The ghost reached out a hand, and where her fingers touched the bedpost, the expensive ebony would instantly shriveled and turn to rot. The message was clear. The wealth they had killed for was meaningless in the face of the soul they had betrayed, and the walls of their palace would provide no protection from the ghost of their greed. As the candle flickered and died, Amara vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only a puddle of cold river water and a single, wet jasmine flower on Zola's pillow. Zola screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that echoed through the halls, waking the chief and the guards. The haunting had begun, not with a blow, but with a reminder that the dead do not forget, and the river always returns what it was forced to take. Chief Okonkwo retreated to his private vault, a room reinforced with thick stone and iron, where his most precious ivory and gold were stored. He believed that within these walls, surrounded by the physical manifestations of his power, he could escape the chilling draft that seemed to follow him through the palace. The air in the vault was usually dry and smelled of old parchment, but tonight it carried the cloying, heavy scent of stagnant water and decaying lilies. As he reached for a heavy gold chalice, his fingers brushed against a surface that felt unnaturally cold and slick, as if it had been submerged in a lake for a century. He pulled his hand back in horror to find his palm covered in a thin, gray slime that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent light. The gold itself began to change before his eyes, the bright yellow luster fading into a dull, leaden gray, the metal softening like wet clay under his touch. From the corners of the room, the ivory tusks began to groan, the sound like bones snapping under immense pressure as hairline fractures spread across their polished surfaces. Dark, ink-like fluid began to seep from these cracks, weeping down the ivory and pooling on the floor in the shape of small, barefoot footprints. The chief backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as the footprints began to multiply, circling him with a slow, deliberate rhythm that mimicked a funeral march. I gave you life, and I had the right to take it. Okonkwo bellowed into the darkness, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never known. The only answer was a soft, melodic laugh that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, a sound that was once Amara's joy, now sharpened into a blade of pure malice. The torches in the vault suddenly turned a deep, ghostly blue, casting shadows that didn't align with the objects in the room, making the chief feel like a ghost in his own sanctuary. Suddenly, a pile of gold coins shifted and cascaded to the floor, revealing Amara's face formed in the metal, her mouth open in a silent, eternal scream of betrayal. The chief scrambled for the door, his heavy boots slipping on the slime, the realization dawning on him that his wealth was no longer a shield, but a conductor for his daughter's wrath. He burst into the hallway, leaving behind his treasures, unaware that the rot he had seen in the vault was now beginning to fester in his own soul. Kofi sat before his kiln, the orange glow of the fire dancing across his weary face, but the heat could not reach the icy core of his grief. He had spent the day since the funeral molding a life-sized statue of Amara, pouring his agony into the red clay until his fingernails were cracked and bleeding. The village thought him mad, a man broken by loss. But to Kofi, the clay was the only thing that felt real in a world that had become a lie. As the fire reached its peak intensity, the flames did not roar. Instead, they began to hiss and turn a vibrant, unnatural violet. The kiln door, though bolted shut, began to rattle violently, as if something within was trying to claw its way out into the physical world. Kofi did not run. He stood his ground, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a desperate, wild hope that his love had found a way back to him. The kiln exploded outward, not with heat, but with a wave of freezing mist that extinguished every torch in the workshop and left the room in a state of silver twilight. Standing amidst the shards of glowing pottery was the spectral form of Amara, her hair floating around her head as if she were still suspended in the river's current. She looked at the clay statue Kofi had built, and for a fleeting moment, the terrifying indigo light in her eyes softened into the warmth he remembered. She reached out a translucent hand and touched his cheek, and though her touch felt like a shard of ice, Kofi did not flinch, leaning into the contact with a sob that broke the silence. He could see the jagged wounds on her throat where the river rocks had torn her, and the sight fueled a protective rage that burned brighter than any kiln fire. She could not speak with human words, but as their spirits touched, he saw the image of her parents pushing her into the abyss, the betrayal playing out in his mind like a vision of fire and blood. "Justice," she whispered, the words sounding like the rustle of dry leaves, yet it carried the weight of an unbreakable command. She pointed toward the palace on the hill, her form beginning to flicker and dissolve back into the mist as the morning sun threatened to rise. Kofi stood alone in the ruins of his workshop, the clay statue now hardened into a permanent weeping monument, knowing that his role was no longer just to mourn, but to be the hand of the ghost in the world of the living. To prove to the village that the curse was nothing but a rumor, Chief Okonkwo ordered a lavish feast, inviting the elders and the neighboring lords to a display of his enduring power. The tables were groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and the finest palm wine, yet a heavy, unnatural silence hung over the guests. Zola sat at her husband's side, her face painted with thick white powders to hide the gaunt, hollowed-out look of a woman who hadn't slept in a week. As the chief raised his goblet to propose a toast to his family's legacy, the wine inside his cup began to thicken and darken, turning from a deep red to the color of stagnant river mud. One by one, the guests looked down at their plates to find the succulent meat crawling with pale, translucent river worms that appeared out of thin air. A woman screamed as her fruit dissolved into a handful of wet silt, and the beautiful music of the harps turned into a discordant, screeching wall of sound. The heavy wooden doors of the banquet hall slammed shut with the force of a thunderclap, and the temperature in the room plummeted until the guest's breath came out in white puffs. In the center of the long table, the ghost of Amara appeared, standing tall and terrifying, her tattered silks billowing in a wind that no one else could feel. She looked at the wealthy elite of Oakhaven, those who had looked the other way while her parents played God, and her presence felt like a physical weight pressing them into their seats. "Eat of the harvest you have sown," a voice echoed, though Amara's lips did not move. The sound seemed to vibrate from the very stones of the palace. The chief tried to stand, but his heavy gold chains suddenly grew tight, pinning him to his throne as if they were living snakes. The guests fled in a blind panic, tripping over their fine robes and spilling their poisoned wine, leaving the chief and Zola alone with the daughter they had murdered for the sake of their pride. Amara walked across the table, her footsteps leaving frost on the silver platters, until she stood directly in front of her mother. She reached out and touched the fine silk of Zola's gown, and the fabric instantly turned into the wet, rotting shroud of a drowned corpse. The vanity Zola had cherished was being stripped away, replaced by the cold reality of her crime, as the ghost made it clear that there was no feast rich enough to mask the scent of their rotting consciences. Following the disastrous feast, the village of Oakhaven fell into a state of terrified chaos, with many believing the gods themselves had turned against the chief. Kofi, fueled by the vision he had received, marched to the village square and stood before the council of elders, demanding that the chief be held accountable for Amara's disappearance. He held aloft the wet jasmine flower he had found near the river, a flower that shouldn't have been in bloom, yet it pulsed with a faint, ghostly light. The elders, usually intimidated by Okonkwo's wealth, could not ignore the signs of the supernatural that were now plaguing their streets, the wells running with salt water and the cattle dying in their stalls. They summoned the chief to the square, but he emerged from his palace looking like a shadow of his former self, his eyes wild and his hair turned white overnight. He clutched his staff as if it were a life raft, his once regal gait now a shambling, broken crawl that drew gasps of pity and horror from the crowd. "Where is your daughter, Okonkwo?" the high priest demanded, his voice a low rumble that commanded the attention of the entire village. The chief tried to speak, to weave another lie about the fever, but every time he opened his mouth, only dry river sand spilled out, choking him and coating his fine robes. The crowd surged forward, their fear turning into a collective anger as they realized the man they had feared was nothing but a hollow shell inhabited by a monstrous secret. Zola tried to intervene, her voice shrill and desperate, but the women of the village turned their backs on her, a gesture of social exile that cut sharper than any blade. She realized then that their wealth had bought them a kingdom of masks, but now the masks were melting away, leaving them exposed to the raw, cold judgment of the community. The social hierarchy they had killed to protect was dissolving in the face of a truth that even the earth itself refused to bury. Suddenly, the sky darkened, and a localized storm centered itself directly over the village square, the rain falling not in drops, but in heavy, rhythmic sheets that smelled of the deep river. In the center of the downpour, the silhouette of Amara appeared once more, her indigo eyes fixed on her father with an intensity that made him fall to his knees. The trial was no longer in the hands of the elders. The spirit of the wronged was now the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the sentence was about to be delivered. The rain turned the village square into a swirling vortex of mud and debris, making it impossible for anyone to move or flee from the spectral judgment. Chief Okonkwo clawed at the ground, his fingers digging into the mire as he tried to reach the safety of his palace, but the earth seemed to be pulling him down. The mud began to rise around his legs, thick and heavy like the hands of 1,000 drowned souls, dragging him into the very element he had used to hide his daughter's body. Zola reached out to grab him, but she too was caught in the rising sludge, her expensive jewelry weighing her down like anchors. She screamed for mercy, but her cries were drowned out by the sound of the Black River, which seemed to be flowing through the streets of the village in a ghostly, invisible flood. The villagers watched from the shelter of their homes, paralyzed by the sight of the earth itself reclaiming the two people who had thought themselves above the laws of nature. Amara descended from the air, her feet barely touching the surface of the mud, her expression one of profound, crystalline sadness rather than simple rage. She placed a hand on her father's head, and in that instant, he was forced to experience every second of her final moments, the cold, the fear, and the agonizing silence of the water. He wailed as the truth shattered his mind, the weight of his guilt becoming a physical force that crushed his chest until he could no longer draw a breath. As the mud rose to their chins, Amara leaned in and whispered into their ears, her voice a chill wind that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to their souls. She told them that their punishment was not death, but to remain in the in-between, tethered to the river and the mud, unable to join the ancestors or find peace in the grave. They were to become the very thing they feared most. A cautionary tale told in whispers, a stain on the lineage they had tried so hard to polish. With a final, gargantuan surge, the earth opened up and swallowed the chief and his wife, the mud smoothing over as if they had never existed. The storm vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving the village square silent and bathed in a strange, golden light that seemed to wash away the gloom. Amara stood alone for a moment, her spectral form glowing with a new, peaceful radiance, before she turned to look at Kofi one last time, a silent promise of a reunion in a world where gold has no power. The sun rose over Oakhaven, painting the freshly washed village in hues of gold and rose, but the usual sounds of mourning, the bustling of market-goers, the laughter of children, were absent. The village square, where the chief and Zola had been swallowed by the mud, was now a pristine, untouched patch of earth, as if the events of the previous day had been nothing but a collective nightmare. Yet, every villager carried the same haunted look in their eyes, a silent testament to the supernatural justice they had witnessed. Kofi stood alone in the square, his potter's hands clasped tightly, staring at the spot where the powerful chief had vanished. He felt a profound sense of quiet, a stillness that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with the heavy finality of a tragedy. The air, usually thick with the scent of wood smoke and cooking fires, now carried a faint, sweet smell of jasmine and wet earth, a lingering spectral perfume that was both comforting and chilling. The elders emerged from their council hut, their faces etched with a new kind of solemnity, their voices hushed as they surveyed the now empty space. They understood that the balance of power in Oakhaven had been irrevocably altered, not by human hands, but by the will of a wronged spirit. The old ways of greed and corruption, once tolerated and even celebrated, now felt like relics of a brutal, unforgivable past. Villagers began to gather, not for trade, but for shared silence, their eyes meeting in unspoken understanding. The story of Amara and Kofi, once a scandalous secret whispered behind closed doors, was now the very fabric of their communal memory. It was a tale of love, betrayal, and a justice so profound it shook the foundations of their world, reminding them that the spirits of the ancestors were always watching, always listening. As the morning dew glistened on the leaves, Kofi noticed a small, perfectly formed jasmine flower blooming on the exact spot where the chief had last stood. It wasn't the season for jasmine, and the flower pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow, a silent message from Amara. It was a sign that her presence, though not physically manifested, remained woven into the very earth of Oakhaven, a constant reminder of the price of cruelty and the enduring power of a love that defied even death. The grand palace of Okonkwo, once a symbol of opulence and unyielding power, now stood silent and desolate on the hill, its once vibrant colors faded to a dull, mournful gray. The guards had fled, the servants had vanished, leaving the sprawling estate to the dust and the lingering chill of Amara's presence. Kofi, feeling an inexplicable pull, found himself walking through its abandoned halls, his footsteps echoing ominously in the cavernous spaces. He moved through rooms that had once bustled with life, now devoid of sound except for the creak of old wood and the distant sigh of the wind. The elaborate tapestries depicting the chief's hunting exploits hung in tatters, covered in what looked like dried river mud, and the once polished floors were now marked with faint, wet footprints that never seemed to dry. It was as if the palace itself was slowly dissolving, mirroring the fate of its former occupants. In what was once Amara's chambers, the air felt thick with a bittersweet melancholy, a mixture of forgotten joys and profound sorrow. Her untouched belongings lay scattered as if she had only just left, a silk scarf draped over a chair, a half-finished embroidery on a small table. Kofi picked up a smooth, river-worn stone from her windowsill, a simple pebble that felt strangely warm, and in that moment, he felt her presence stronger than ever, not as a vengeful spirit, but as the woman he loved. As he stood by her window, looking out over the now peaceful village, he heard a soft, melodic hum, a lullaby Amara used to sing as a child. It wasn't a haunting sound, but a whisper of comfort, a promise that even in death, her essence remained. He realized that Amara was no longer bound by rage. Her justice had been served, and now she was simply there, a guardian spirit woven into the fabric of the land she loved, even if it had betrayed her. He left the palace, but not before placing the small clay bird he had molded for her on her bedside table, a silent offering, a final connection. The palace was no longer a place of fear for him, but a monument to a love that had defied the boundaries of class and even mortality. It stood as a hollow shell, echoing with the ghosts of the past, but also imbued with the quiet, persistent spirit of the woman who had brought it to its knees. Days turned into weeks, and life in Oakhaven slowly began to resume, albeit with a newfound humility and a deeper respect for the unseen forces. The Black River, once a symbol of dread and a final resting place for secrets, began to transform. Its waters, which had run murky and dark for generations, gradually cleared, becoming sparkling and pure, teeming with fish that had never been seen before in its depths. The villagers, initially hesitant, began to return to the riverbanks, not with fear, but with a cautious reverence. Women who had been barren for years found themselves conceiving after bathing in its revitalized waters, and the crops irrigated by the river yielded harvests richer than any in living memory. The river, once known as the Black River, began to be referred to in hushed tones as Amara's tears, for it seemed to weep life back into the land. Kofi spent his days by the river, not to mourn, but to work. He used the purified clay from its banks to create new pottery, vessels that seemed to shimmer with an inner light, reflecting the newfound serenity of the village. His pottery was no longer just functional. It was imbued with a quiet magic, each piece telling a story of love, loss, and the enduring spirit of Amara. One evening, as the sun set and painted the river in strokes of crimson and gold, Kofi saw a faint, shimmering light under the surface. It wasn't a reflection of the sun, but an internal glow emanating from the deepest part of the water. He understood then that Amara's essence was now inextricably linked to the river, that she was no longer merely haunting the land, but nurturing it, transforming it with her enduring spirit. The river, once a place of death, had become a source of life, a testament to Amara's power to not just destroy what was corrupt, but to heal what was broken. It flowed through the land, a constant, gentle reminder that true wealth was not in gold or power, but in the purity of spirit and the resilience of love, a lesson carved into the very heart of Oakhaven by the ghost of a young woman. With the chief and Zola gone, a power vacuum had been created, but instead of chaos, a new form of leadership emerged, guided by humility and wisdom rather than greed. The remaining elders, humbled by the supernatural events, invited Kofi to join their ranks, recognizing the quiet strength and unwavering integrity he had displayed throughout the ordeal. It was an unprecedented move, placing a potter, a common man, at the heart of their governance. The council meetings were no longer held in the stifling, opulent rooms of the palace, but under the ancient baobab tree in the sacred grove where Amara and Kofi had shared their forbidden love. The air there felt purer, cooler, infused with a sense of clarity and ancient wisdom. Decisions were made not for personal gain or political maneuvering, but for the collective well-being of the village, always with a silent acknowledgement of the spirit that watched over them. Kofi spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the quiet weight of truth and compassion, often referring to the lessons of the river or the whispers of the grove. He advocated for the poor, for fairness, and for the kind of communal harmony that Amara had always dreamt of. He built a new bridge across the revitalized river, not of stone, but of sturdy, woven reeds, symbolizing a connection between all people, regardless of their station. The elders listened intently, for they had learned that true power resided not in wealth or status, but in righteousness and connection to the spiritual world. They understood that Kofi was not just a man. He was a bridge between their world and Amara's, a living embodiment of the new order she had ushered in with her sacrifice. The past was a cautionary tale, but the future was a tapestry woven with threads of justice and communal strength. As evening fell, a faint, sweet breeze would sometimes rustle through the leaves of the baobab tree, carrying with it the scent of jasmine. Kofi would pause, a gentle smile gracing his lips, knowing that Amara was approving of their choices, a silent, benevolent guardian ensuring that the new Oakhaven flourished under a banner of genuine virtue, not false pretense. Years passed, and Oakhaven thrived, becoming a beacon of justice and prosperity in the land, its story of the vengeful spirit spreading far and wide. The memory of Amara was not one of fear, but of reverence, her sacrifice, a powerful reminder that love and truth were eternal, while greed and deceit were fleeting. The village children, rather than being told scary tales, learned of the crimson shroud of Amara, not as a symbol of death, but of cleansing and renewal. Kofi grew into a wise and revered elder, his face lined with the wisdom of a man who had walked between worlds. He never remarried, his heart forever bound to Amara, but he nurtured the village's children as his own, teaching them the values of compassion and integrity. He kept Amara's silk scarf, the one he had found in her empty room, always close, sometimes catching the faint scent of jasmine clinging to its threads. The old palace, once a symbol of tyranny, was eventually dismantled, its stones used to build a communal school and a healing lodge by the river. The grand halls that had echoed with fear now hummed with the joyous sounds of learning and mending. The villagers had consciously chosen to erase the physical manifestation of the chief's dark reign, replacing it with structures that truly served the people, embodying Amara's gentle spirit of community. On the anniversary of her disappearance, the villagers would gather by Amara's Tears River, each person casting a single red hibiscus flower onto the water. The flowers would float downstream, painting the river in a crimson path, a beautiful and poignant tribute to the young woman whose love had transformed their world. It was a day not of mourning, but of celebration, a celebration of her fierce spirit and the lasting legacy of her profound love. As Kofi sat by the river, watching the crimson flowers drift away, he would sometimes see a fleeting, shimmering reflection on the water, not his own, but a glimpse of Amara's smiling face. In those moments, he knew that her spirit was not only at peace, but eternally woven into the land she had saved. The crimson shroud was no longer a metaphor for vengeance, but for the vibrant, life-giving blood of a new, just era for Oakhaven, bought with the ultimate sacrifice of a love too pure for its time. The peace of Oakhaven was interrupted by the arrival of Django, a merchant from the northern plains known for his cold eyes and a heart that beat only for the clink of metal. He arrived with a caravan of black-maned horses, his eyes immediately fixed on the revitalized river that had become the lifeblood of the village. Django had heard rumors of the magic in the water, how it healed the sick and made the crops grow triple their size, and he saw not a miracle, but a commodity to be bottled and sold. Django stood at the edge of the riverbank, his boots sinking into the rich, red silt, and spit into the clear water with a sneer of disbelief. To a man who dealt in iron and blood, the talk of ghosts and ancestral justice was merely a fairy tale used to keep the weak-minded in check. He began to direct his men to set up iron pumps, intending to siphon the river's essence into heavy bronze casks, unmindful of the sacred nature of the site. Kofi approached the merchant, his walk steady and his eyes burning with a quiet, protective fire that made Django's guards hesitate. "This river does not belong to those who take," Kofi said, his voice carrying the rhythmic weight of a drumbeat. "It belongs to the one who gave everything." Django merely laughed, a harsh, metallic sound that seemed to grate against the harmony of the singing birds, as he pushed past Kofi to tighten a bolt on his machinery. As the first iron pipe broke the surface of the water, the river didn't splash. It recoiled, the current pulling away from the metal as if in physical pain. The sky, which had been a clear, vibrant blue, suddenly bruised into a deep indigo, and the wind began to howl with a sound that resembled a woman's sob. Django's men looked around in panic, their bravado evaporating like mist, as the temperature plummeted and the iron pipes began to frost over in the midday heat. Amara did not appear as a person this time, but as a violent surge in the water, a towering wave that took the shape of a colossal hand. The wave crashed against the iron pumps, not with the force of liquid, but with the weight of solid stone, shattering the merchant's equipment into twisted, useless scraps. Django fell back, his face turning the color of ash, as he realized that some treasures are guarded by forces that cannot be bargained with or bought. That night, Django and his remaining men retreated to their camp on the outskirts of the village, huddled around a fire that refused to throw off any heat. The merchant paced like a caged animal, his mind still racing with ways to conquer the river, his greed blinding him to the warning he had been given. He clutched a small vial of the river water he had managed to scoop up, watching as the liquid inside turned from clear to a pulsing, angry red. As the campfire flickered, the shadows cast by the tents began to stretch and warp, detaching themselves from the canvas to dance in a slow, agonizing circle. Django's men fell into a deep, unnatural sleep, their snores turning into wet, gurgling gasps as if they were drowning on dry land. Django tried to scream for them to wake up, but his voice was trapped in his throat, his lungs feeling as though they were filling with cold, heavy silt. From the darkness of the woods, the ghost of Amara emerged, her form more terrifying than ever before, draped in a shroud of moving water and crimson silk. She did not approach the fire. She simply stood at the edge of the light, her glowing eyes fixed on the vial of water in Django's hand. The glass began to crack in his grip, the shards cutting into his palm, but instead of blood, a stream of dark river mud flowed from his wounds. The ghost raised her hand, and the iron coins in Django's belt pouch began to grow red-hot, searing through his clothes and branding his skin with the image of a broken tusk. He collapsed to his knees, the weight of his own greed physically crushing him, as the whispers of the river filled his mind with the screams of those he had exploited in the past. Amara was not just punishing him for the river. She was acting as a mirror to his own blackened soul, showing him the rot he carried. As dawn approached, Django was found by the villagers wandering the road, his mind broken and his hands perpetually stained with mud that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He had lost the ability to speak, able only to point toward the river with a look of absolute, soul-shattering terror. The caravan was left behind, the horses freed, and the iron merchant became a living ghost, a wanderer who warned all he met that some wealth carries a price that can only be paid in eternity. Kofi, sensing the toll these hauntings were taking on the spiritual balance of the land, retreated to the secret grove of whispers to seek a deeper communion with Amara. He knew that while her vengeance was just, her soul was becoming tethered to the darkness of the acts she had to perform to protect the village. He sat beneath the ancient baobab, lit a single candle, and began to chant the old songs of the ancestors, his voice a bridge across the veil. The air grew still, and the veil between the living and the dead thinned until the grove felt like it was floating in a sea of stars. Amara appeared, her form flickering between the terrifying, vengeful spirit and the gentle girl she had been, her face etched with a weariness that broke Kofi's heart. She reached out to him, and this time, he was able to take her hand, not with his physical body, but with his spirit, the two of them meeting in a space beyond time. "You must not let the darkness of their hearts become your own," Kofi whispered, his soul weeping as he felt the coldness radiating from her spectral form. He shared with her the memories of their laughter, the scent of the clay, and the warmth of the sun on their faces, using his love as an anchor to pull her back from the abyss of pure rage. He showed her the children playing by the river and the elders leading with wisdom, proving that her sacrifice had already won the battle. Amara's indigo eyes flickered, the harsh light softening into a tender glow as she leaned her head against his spectral chest, much as she had done when they were alive. The weight of the world's cruelty seemed to lift from her shoulders, and for a moment, the grove was filled with a light so pure it would have blinded a mortal eye. They were no longer a potter and a ghost. They were two halves of a single, eternal flame, defying the tragedy that had tried to extinguish them. As the vision faded, Kofi felt a new sense of purpose. He realized that his role was to be the keeper of her light, to ensure that the village lived in a way that didn't require her to be a monster. Amara retreated back into the river, but her presence was now calm, a protective warmth rather than a freezing chill. The grove remained sacred, a place where the barrier between life and death was no longer a wall, but a window through which love could still shine. In a neighboring kingdom, a greedy king named Zamba heard of the iron merchant's failure and decided to take the river by force, sending a small army to seize Oakhaven. He believed that he could intimidate the villagers and the little ghost girl with the sheer volume of his spears and the thunder of his drums. As his army approached the borders, they found not a village in fear, but a landscape that seemed to be watching them with 1,000 invisible eyes. Before they could even reach the village gates, the ground beneath the soldiers' feet began to dry and crack, the lush grass turning to gray dust in a matter of seconds. Every canteen the soldiers carried suddenly felt empty, and when they tried to dig for water, they found only dry, white bones buried just beneath the surface. The drought followed them like a shadow, a localized curse that affected only those who marched with intent to harm the sacred land of Oakhaven. King Zamba, riding at the front on a golden chariot, watched in horror as his horses collapsed from a thirst that no water could slake. He looked toward the river in the distance, seeing it flowing blue and beautiful, yet every time his men tried to approach, the distance seemed to double. It was a psychological torture, a mirage of life that stayed forever out of reach for those whose hearts were filled with the desire for conquest. The ghost of Amara appeared at the boundary of the village, standing atop a hill of red clay, her arm outstretched like a barrier that no spear could pierce. She did not strike them. She simply let the environment reflect their own emptiness back at them, the sun growing hotter and the wind blowing sand into their eyes. The soldiers began to drop their weapons and flee, realizing that they were fighting not a village, but the very spirit of the earth itself. Zamba was left alone in his chariot, his gold melting under the unnatural heat until it fused his feet to the floor of the vehicle. He begged for a single drop of water, but the only response was a gentle rain that fell just a few feet away, nourishing the soil of Oakhaven while he stood in a desert of his own making. He eventually retreated, a king without an army, haunted by the image of the young woman who turned the very elements into a shield for the innocent. As the years of peace solidified Oakhaven's reputation, a master weaver named Nala was commissioned to create a tapestry that would tell the story of Amara for generations to come. Nala sat at her loom, her fingers moving with a grace that seemed guided by more than just skill, using threads dyed in the colors of the river, the sunset, and the earth. She didn't just weave patterns. She wove the emotions of the village, the sorrow of the loss and the triumph of the justice. The tapestry grew to be 20 feet long, and as it neared completion, something miraculous happened. The figures in the silk began to move. When the wind blew through the communal hall where it hung, the image of Amara would seem to turn her head and smile, and the depicted river would shimmer as if real sunlight were hitting it. It became a living record, a spiritual artifact that hummed with a low, comforting vibration that calmed anyone who stood near it. Kofi would often sit before the tapestry in the evenings, talking to the image of Amara as if she were sitting right beside him, sharing the news of the day. The villagers followed his lead, coming to the tapestry to ask for guidance or to offer thanks for the blessings in their lives. The ghost of the young woman had moved from being a terrifying specter of revenge to becoming a patron saint of the community, a symbol of the enduring power of the heart. One night, as Kofi touched the woven image of Amara's hand, he felt a spark of warmth that traveled through his entire body, a final blessing of vitality. He knew his time was drawing near, but he felt no fear, only a profound, quiet excitement for the reunion he knew awaited him at the river's edge. The story of the ghost of the poor man's lover had reached its final chapter in the world of men, but its true ending was just beginning in the realm of spirits. The tapestry remains in Oakhaven to this day, a testament to the fact that while wealth can build palaces, only love can build a legacy that survives the grave. The red jasmine continues to bloom in the square, and the river still runs clear, singing a song of a woman who was killed for love, but who returned to teach her people how to truly live. Time, like the river, flowed relentlessly over the stones of Oakhaven, and the once strong hands of Kofi became gnarled like the roots of the ancient baobab. His hair had turned to a shock of white wool, and his back was bent, not by the weight of labor, but by the accumulation of 1,000 memories. He still sat at his wheel, though his movements were slower now, the clay responding more to his spirit than to his fading physical strength. The village children would gather around him, sitting in the red dust of his workshop, their eyes wide as he told them stories of the woman who became the river. He didn't speak of the blood or the terror of the haunting. Instead, he spoke of her laughter, which sounded like silver bells, and her heart, which was a garden of kindness. To these children, Amara was not a ghost to be feared in the dark, but a guardian sister who ensured the rains came and the justice was served. One afternoon, as the heat of the sun shimmered over the horizon, Kofi felt a familiar, cool breeze settle over his shoulders, despite there being no wind. He looked up to see a translucent figure standing by his drying racks, her hand resting on a finished jar, her face unchanged by the decades that had weathered his. Amara looked at him with a tenderness that made his ancient heart skip a beat, her indigo eyes now glowing with a soft, inviting radiance. "It is almost time, my love," she didn't say, yet the words formed in his mind like the scent of rain on parched earth. Kofi smiled, a toothless, joyous expression that made him look like the young boy she had first loved in the grove so many years ago. He was not afraid of the coming shadow. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this transition, building a bridge of character that would finally allow him to walk across the water to her side. He reached out his trembling, clay-stained hand, and for the first time in 50 years, he felt the solid, warm weight of her fingers interlacing with his. The coldness that had once defined her ghost was gone, replaced by a vibrant, living energy that pulsed through his veins, rejuvenating his tired soul. The workshop seemed to fade away, replaced by a vision of the grove as it was in their youth, a place of eternal sunset and unending peace. Word spread through Oakhaven that the great potter was nearing the end of his journey, and a silent, reverent procession formed toward his modest hut. The people brought no gold or ivory, for they knew Kofi valued only the currency of the spirit. Instead, they brought flowers, fresh water, and songs of gratitude. The new elders stood at the threshold, their heads bowed in respect for the man who had been the moral compass of their kingdom for half a century. Inside the hut, the air was cool and smelled of jasmine and wet clay, an atmosphere that felt more like a temple than a dwelling. Kofi lay on a simple mat, surrounded by the pottery he had made throughout his life, each piece a vessel for a specific memory of Amara. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, seeing the legacy of justice they had built together, and he knew that Oakhaven was finally safe from the shadows of the past. "Do not weep for the potter when the clay is finished," Kofi whispered, his voice a frail but steady rasp that commanded the silence of the room. He told them that his death was not an end, but the final stroke of the brush on a masterpiece they had all been painting since the day of the betrayal. He asked them to remember that the river was not just water, but a promise, and that as long as they lived with integrity, Amara would never truly leave them. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden bars of light through the window, the temperature in the room dropped significantly. A soft, blue mist began to seep from the floorboards, swirling around Kofi's bed like a protective shroud, and the villagers felt a sense of profound peace wash over them. They knew the River Queen had come for her king, and the room was filled with the silent, majestic presence of a love that had conquered the grave. The high priest stepped forward and placed a single red hibiscus on Kofi's chest, a symbol of the blood that had been shed and the beauty that had grown from it. The villagers began to hum a low, melodic dirge, the sound rising and falling with the rhythm of the nearby river, a communal heartbeat that escorted the potter toward the veil. There was no fear in the room, only a sacred, heavy awe as the boundaries between the two worlds grew thin enough to touch. In his final breath, Kofi felt his spirit rise from his aching bones, shedding the weight of age and the weariness of the world like a tattered cloak. He stood on the banks of the Black River, but it was no longer the dark, terrifying place of his memories. It was a sea of liquid light, shimmering with the colors of 1,000 rainbows. On the opposite shore, he saw the golden city of the ancestors, its spires reaching toward a sky that knew no night. Amara was there, standing in the center of the current, her robes no longer tattered but woven from the very light of the stars. She held out her arms, and as Kofi stepped into the water, he found that it did not pull him down. It supported him, the ripples singing beneath his feet like the strings of a harp. Every step he took toward her made him younger, stronger, and more luminous, until he stood before her as the vibrant young man who had once carved her name into the baobab tree. They met in the middle of the river, their spirits merging in an explosion of light that could be seen by the villagers back in the physical world as a sudden, brilliant flash in the evening sky. There were no words needed, for their souls had been in conversation for 50 years, and now the dialogue was complete. The river, which had once been a site of murder and treachery, had become the altar of their eternal union, a place where the broken was made whole. As they walked toward the Golden City, the spirits of those who had been wronged in the past rose from the depths to greet them, their faces clear and their hearts at peace. Amara was no longer a ghost of vengeance, but the queen of the redeemed, and Kofi was her consort, the guardian of memory. They were the first to cross who had brought the light of the living into the realm of the dead, creating a new path for all who would follow. Behind them, the physical river in Oakhaven surged with a sudden, joyous wave, its waters turning a brilliant, translucent blue that would never fade. The villagers watching from the shore saw two white herons rise from the reeds, flying side by side toward the setting sun until they disappeared into the light. The potter and the princess were gone from the earth, but the bridge they had built remained, a permanent link between the seen and the unseen. Days after Kofi's passing, the villagers entered his workshop to organize his affairs and found something that defied the laws of nature. On the center of his wheel sat the small clay bird he had molded for Amara decades ago, the one he had left in the palace and later recovered. Though it was made of simple earth and had never been fired in a kiln, the bird was now pulsing with a warm, golden light and felt as hard as diamond to the touch. When the village children touched the bird, they didn't just feel stone. They heard the stories of their ancestors, the music of the grove, and the promise of the river. It became the most sacred relic in Oakhaven, a physical manifestation of the love that had saved them all from the chief's greed. They placed it in a shrine built at the river's edge, where the light from the bird would guide travelers through the darkest nights. The bird was said to sing whenever a child was born in the village, a high, sweet note that signaled the arrival of a new soul into the protected land. It was a reminder that while people pass away, the beauty they create and the love they leave behind becomes part of the very atoms of the world. The clay bird was the heart of Oakhaven, a silent witness to the fact that even the humblest material can be made divine by the touch of a pure spirit. Nala the weaver added a final panel to her great tapestry, depicting the two herons flying over a river of stars with a clay bird perched upon a baobab branch. This final image completed the story, turning the tragedy into a hymn of victory that would be sung at every festival and wedding for 1,000 years. The ghost of the young woman was now the goddess of the river, and her story was the foundation upon which a new civilization was built. The shrine of the clay bird became a place of pilgrimage for those from distant lands who sought to learn how to live in harmony with the spirits. They didn't come for gold or ivory. They came to touch the bird and remember that the greatest wealth is found in the things that cannot be stolen or buried. Oakhaven was no longer just a village. It was a sanctuary, a living testimony to the power of a love that returned from the dark to bring the light. A century passed, and the names of the chief and Zola were forgotten by all but the oldest scrolls, buried under the weight of their own ignominy. But the names of Amara and Kofi remained as fresh as the morning dew, carved into the hearts of every generation that walked the red paths of the kingdom. Oakhaven had grown into a great city, but it was a city without walls, for its people knew that their true protection came from the spirit that resided in the water. Every year, on the night of the full moon, the people would look toward the river and see two shimmering figures walking along the bank, hand in hand. They weren't ghosts of sorrow anymore. They were the eternal sentinels, the watchers who ensured that no shadow of greed ever took root in the soil of their home again. Their presence brought a sense of profound security, a knowledge that the scales of justice were held by hands that knew the value of mercy. The river, now legendary throughout the continent, remained the purest source of life, its waters never failing even in the harshest droughts. It was said that if a person with a heavy heart sat by the bank and whispered their sorrows to the current, the water would carry the pain away, leaving them with the peace of the grove. The legacy of Amara was not just a story. It was a living, breathing part of the environment, a spiritual ecosystem of love and accountability. As the sun sets on our tale, we see a young couple, a girl of high birth, and a boy of no means, sitting in the very same grove where Amara and Kofi once dreamed. They are not afraid, for they live in a world that honors their bond, a world created by the woman who refused to stay dead until the world was made right for them. They look at the river, see the two herons in the sky, and know that their love is part of a much larger, much older song. The crimson shroud of Amara has become the golden cloak of Oakhaven, a mantle of light that protects all who dwell within its reach. The story ends as all great legends do, not with a goodbye, but with a remember, a call to every soul to value the person over the prize. And in the quiet of the night, if you listen closely to the rustle of the baobab leaves, you can still hear the whisper of two lovers, finally at home, finally at peace. As the fame of Oakhaven's magic river spread across the savannah, it inevitably reached the ears of those who dealt in the forbidden arts. A secret society known as the Obsidian Eye, led by a sorcerer named Mosi, arrived under the guise of traveling scholars. Unlike the iron merchants who wanted the water for profit, Mosi sought to enslave the spirit of Amara itself, believing that a ghost of such power could be bound into a relic to grant him immortality. Mosi did not approach the river with machinery. He approached with rituals of shadow, pouring vials of bitter, darkened oils into the shallows to poison the spiritual connection between the water and the ancestors. He and his followers sat in a circle of blackened stones, chanting in a tongue that sounded like the cracking of dry bone, trying to force the river queen to manifest in a state of pain. The sky over Oakhaven did not turn blue or red. It turned a sickly, bruised yellow, and the birds fell silent as if the very air had become toxic. Kofi's successor, a young priestess named Zani, felt the disturbance in her marrow and gathered the villagers at the shrine of the clay bird. She realized that this was not a battle of spears, or even of simple greed, but a war of the spirit, where the purity of Amara was being used as a target for malice. The Obsidian Eye was trying to rewrite the story of the sacrifice into a tale of eternal suffering, hoping to feed off the ghost's ancient rage. As Mosi cast a heavy, obsidian chain into the water, the river began to boil, but not with heat. It churned with a cold, spectral fury that sent shards of ice flying through the air. The sorcerer laughed, thinking he had snared his prize, as a distorted, screaming image of Amara began to rise from the depths, her features twisted by the dark magic. But Mosi had made a fatal error. He assumed Amara was a lonely spirit, forgetting that she was now anchored by the collective love of 1,000 people. Zani led the villagers in a song of remembrance, a melody that Kofi had composed in his final years, which acted as a spiritual shield against the sorcerer's chants. The sound of 1,000 voices, clear and filled with genuine love, shattered the obsidian chain like it was made of brittle glass. The dark oils in the water were purged by a sudden, brilliant flash of crimson light, and Mosi found himself staring not at a bound slave, but at the full unbridled majesty of a goddess who had the entire earth as her witness. The sorcerer Mosi stood paralyzed as the spirit of Amara expanded until she loomed over the entire valley, her shroud weaving through the clouds like a celestial river. She did not strike him with lightning. Instead, she forced him to look into the dark mirror of his own intentions, showing him the emptiness of a life lived only for power. Every shadow he had ever cast, every soul he had ever manipulated, came back to haunt him in a single, crushing moment of clarity. The followers of the Obsidian Eye fled into the wilderness, their black robes catching fire with a white, cold flame that didn't burn the skin but consumed their magical trinkets. Mosi was left alone in the circle of stones, his eyes turning as white as the river foam as his mind was wiped clean of his dark incantations. He had sought immortality, and Amara granted him a version of it. He was turned into a stone statue at the edge of the woods, a permanent sentinel of warning for any who would try to weaponize the sacred. As the sorcerer turned to stone, the sickly yellow sky cracked open to reveal a sunset of such intense beauty that the villagers fell to their knees in worship. The river settled into a deep, peaceful sapphire, and the fish jumped high out of the water as if celebrating a second liberation. Amara's image faded slowly, leaving behind a feeling of profound cleanliness, as if the very atoms of the valley had been scrubbed of the sorcerer's filth. Zani stood by the riverbank, her hands glowing with a faint blue light that signaled her official crowning as the new guardian of the waters. She understood now that the peace of Oakhaven required constant vigilance, and that the story of Amara would always be a target for those who lacked their own light. The obsidian statue of Mosi remained as a grim landmark, a reminder that the River Queen's mercy ended where the desecration of the soul began. That night, the village didn't celebrate with loud drums. They celebrated with a feast of lights, floating thousands of small lanterns down the river. Each lantern represented a prayer for those who were lost, and a vow to protect the purity of their home. The ghost of the young woman was no longer just a legend of the past. She was the living conscience of the present, a force that demanded that every heart in Oakhaven remain as clear as the water they drank. Years of prosperity followed the defeat of the Obsidian Eye, and the city of Oakhaven became a center of art and philosophy, famous for its living tapestries and glowing pottery. A peculiar phenomenon began to occur. Thousands of weaver birds, colored in shades of crimson and gold, began to nest in the trees surrounding the city. These birds didn't just chirp. Their collective song seemed to harmonize with the rhythmic flow of the river, creating a constant, low-frequency hum that eased the minds of the weary. Travelers came from across the desert just to sit under the trees and listen to the chorus of Amara, claiming that the song could heal broken hearts and bring visions of lost loved ones. The birds were seen as the messengers of the River Queen, a physical extension of her voice in the canopy of the world. It was said that if a person spoke a lie in the presence of the weaver birds, the birds would stop singing and turn their backs, a social cue that kept the city's honesty at an all-time high. A young scholar named Kwame began to transcribe the patterns of the weaver birds' nests, discovering that they were weaving the history of the village into the very structures of their homes. Every twist of grass and every knotted reed corresponded to a line of the great tragedy of Amara and Kofi, as if nature itself was ensuring the story would never be lost. The birds were the librarians of the spirit, preserving the legacy in a language that predated human speech. One evening, Kwame saw a weaver bird carry a single thread of white silk, the same silk from Amara's ancient burial shroud, and weave it into a nest at the center of the grove. As the moon rose, the nest glowed with an ethereal light, and for a brief moment, the ghost of Amara could be seen sitting among the branches, feeding the birds from her hand. She was no longer a figure of vengeance or even of high majesty. She was a part of the ecology, as natural and necessary as the rain or the soil. The Song of the Weaver Birds became the national anthem of Oakhaven, a melody that was taught to every child before they could even walk. It reminded the people that they were part of a delicate balance, and that their actions echoed through the natural world. The weaver birds remained as a vibrant, fluttering testament to the fact that when a soul is treated with justice, even the animals of the air will rise to sing its praises.